Broadcasting from Detroit's Cass Corridor, it's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. Today on the show, Detroit's city clerk says less than 5 polling places have accessibility problems. Disability advocates say it's more than 90%, and they've got the data to back that up. Plus, sociologist Eve Ewing makes the case that American education was designed to control students, not just teach them. We'll ask her what needs to change. But first, last month, some big news came to West Michigan. The Palisades nuclear plant in Covert Township got one step closer to reopening after federal regulators allowed the plant's owners to load fuel into the facility. Some reporting suggests that Holtec International plans to reopen the reactor by October. That move is part of a larger trend. In recent years, there's been a lot more political energy behind opening nuclear reactors. During his time as president, Joe Biden unveiled a plan to ramp up America's nuclear energy capacity. When he got into office, President Donald Trump signed an executive order with the goal of quadrupling nuclear power in 25 years. Now, many climate change defenders are divided on these decisions. That's because nuclear energy could provide a ton of clean energy for Americans, but it also has the capacity to kill people and contaminate the earth. That's why environmentalists have generally stood against the nuclear comeback comeback. So how should we look at nuclear energy? Laura Krantz is a journalist, editor, producer, and co-founder of Foxtopus Inc. And she produced the 2022 podcast Wild Thing, Going Nuclear, where she explored the possibilities and the drawbacks of nuclear energy. To discuss these complexities, we have Laura Krantz with us now. Laura, welcome to the Metro.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So, Laura, your podcast, Wild Thing, Going Nuclear, tells us about the meltdown of the SL-1 nuclear reactor in rural Idaho back in the 60s. The explosion killed 3 men and exposed thousands in the nearby towns to radioactive gases. Now, all this took place 45 minutes outside your hometown of Idaho Falls, a place I have been to many times because I used to live in Jackson, Wyoming. What originally got you interested in that event?
Yeah, so there were kind of 2 things going on. First of all, you'd think that if a nuclear reactor blew up near your hometown, even if it was 60 years ago, you'd know about it, right? Like you'd hear about these stories. And I didn't even hear about this until I was in my 20s, if not my 30s. I'd, long left home. And my dad had even grown up in Idaho Falls and was around when it happened. But for some reason, it wasn't a really well-known story. And, you kind of gave a good explanation of what had happened. But this happened at the National Reactor Testing Station, which is now known as the Idaho National Lab, out in the Arco Desert. And they were running all kinds of experiments on nuclear energy in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And then I was hearing about this story. And then there's this resurgence of interest in nuclear energy that's been happening over the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years.
Yeah.
As more communities are thinking about energy demands, as companies are thinking about energy demands, and realizing that coal and oil and natural gas, the fossil fuels that we've been dependent on for so long, that's detrimental to continue to use those because of climate change. What other energy sources can we have that are stable and, aren't subject to the vagaries of weather or time of day?
Sure. I mean, and I do want to get into the quandaries that this energy really poses, which you do such a great job of helping us to think about in your podcast. But first, I realize this is complicated, but I would like you to try and briefly explain how nuclear reactors work.
Okay, I'm going to preface this by saying I did a whole episode on this for Wild Thing, and there were some tears when I was writing it because I am not a scientist. or a nuclear engineer, or I don't even have a science degree. So as a humanities person coming into this and trying to understand it, I cried a little bit because I was struggling. But
you did a fantastic job. I listened to the episode and you distilled everything in a way that kept me awake and alive and engaged. So
okay,
bravo.
Good. I'm going to try again. Okay. So, on the most basic level, nuclear reactors use a process called fission to produce energy. This involves splitting atoms, which contain huge amounts of energy relative to their size. Atoms are the smallest unit of matter. Anything that takes up space or has volume is made of atoms. And then they, in turn, are made up of smaller particles known as subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, and electrons. Certain atoms are considered unstable. They are usually heavier elements like uranium, and these have a larger number of protons and neutrons. And the instability of these atoms means they shed these off. This is radiation. This is what we call radiation, this expelling of excess protons and neutrons. And sometimes during this process, the atoms fission or split, and they send out more neutrons. Those neutrons bump into other uranium atoms and destabilize them further, causing additional fissions. And you get more and more neutrons zinging around, hitting more and more atoms. This is a chain reaction, and it continues to go until you either run out of atoms or you stop that reaction. So this is the basics of how a reactor works. You have a core of fuel. It's usually made out of uranium or plutonium. And in that core, there are slots where control rods can be removed or inserted to either speed up or slow down the reaction. A control rod is usually made of elements that are good at absorbing loose neutrons, like graphite, carbon, boron, cadmium. In a reactor, you get the fission process started, and then you use the control rods to try and ensure a constant rate of fission. One atom splits, it releases neutrons, but only one of those goes on to cause another fission, rather than sending out a whole bunch and then getting this larger and larger and larger number of atoms that are fissioning. And if you're doing it right, the process gives off a stable amount of heat, which can then be used to create non-radioactive energy. So for instance, in a boiling water reactor, which is really the only one I have much familiarity with because of what I studied learning about SL1, the water goes into the reactor vessel, which is the part that holds the fuel. The heat of the fissioning atoms causes the water to boil. That creates steam. The steam turns a turbine, and that creates electricity. And that's the most simple version. There are lots of other types that I am less familiar with, so I'm going to leave that to the experts to explain how those work.
Laura, I think we need more humanities people like you in the science sphere. So Americans were really excited about this in the 1950s and 60s. Why?
Well, you have to think about that time period. So 1945, the bombs. That's really Americans' first exposure to nuclear energy, and it was pretty scary. But in the aftermath of that, there was a lot of attention given to the idea of nuclear as a form of energy rather than a form of destruction. And all of this feels like very cutting-edge science and technology. It's kind of like a prequel to the space race. It's about scientific progress and economic growth. You had the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission saying that nuclear would make electricity too cheap to meter, like it would just basically, electricity would be free. You had all these like grandiose ideas of reshaping the landscape using nuclear explosives. This was known as Project Plowshare, and it's bananas. I suggest reading about that separately. But we had these ideas of tiny reactors powering our cars and our planes, mini reactors in our basements powering our houses. We were still trying to figure out all the nuances and capabilities of nuclear power, and we didn't always understand what we were playing with, but it felt like it held a lot of promise.
Yeah, I want to get a little bit deeper into the pros and cons, because when we think about the promise, I mean, people today want nuclear energy to specifically provide clean energy. Why do people like nuclear energy as a substitute to or in addition to solar and wind and hydrogen energy? Why is it a viable option?
Well, solar and wind at this point are kind of dependent on, the time of day and the weather. And they're great for peak energy. They're not always consistent. If the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, you're not going to have that steady energy. Or alternatively, those sources will produce a tremendous amount of energy, but we don't have the kind of big systems in place to store it. We're not there yet with batteries. I think we're starting to get there, but we haven't accomplished it yet. And right now, the world is turning more and more towards electric and electrification, electric cars, data centers, all the demands that AI has put on the system. And those require a lot of energy, and they require it at all hours of the day. This is known as base load power. You have to have like this basic, a minimum amount that's going to provide energy to all of these different demands. So this is where nuclear can kind of step in, because nuclear can operate in bad weather. It can operate in really bad climates. It can produce energy at all hours of the day. And I think the feeling is that this provides a steady source of energy. The radioactive emissions from a plant are minimal, less than coal. Coal puts a lot of actual radioactivity into the air. It's not something we ever really talk about. The biggest issue, of course, is if something happens at a plant and it, blows up, or there's a leak or something of that nature. But once you have a plant created, it can last a very long time. You don't have to use a ton of fuel. You don't have to refuel it constantly the way you do with coal or gas or oil. So there's some real advantages to it.
Okay, so nuclear energy has this level of reliability that is very appealing to people. But there's a reason that much of the world, including the U.S., moved away from nuclear energy, right? There were nuclear accidents at Chernobyl and Fukushima, and nuclear energy is associated with U.S. attacks on Japan, which you, of course, talk about in your podcast, which killed hundreds of thousands. Even though the risk of nuclear accidents are low, when they do happen, they really freak people out. And as we mentioned, you studied an experimental reactor that blew up and killed 3 men in Idaho Falls in the 60s. What went wrong at that national testing site?
Well, it's very interesting because as I was reading about this, there's a lot of rumor and conjecture. Was it a love triangle that 2 of the men and one of their wives were involved in? Was it a murder suicide? There's all this rumor swirling around it. But as you really dig into it, it became clear that this was a test reactor that the Army was building. It was a prototype for bases that they wanted to build at the Arctic in order to be able or reactors they wanted to build at the Arctic in order to be able to support the bases there without having to bring fuel in, which is that makes things very delicate for those bases. And this prototype, they didn't really do a good job maintaining it. And there were report after report after report of problems with the control rod sticking, of things not working well. And they'd shut the reactor down at the end of 1960 for routine maintenance. And in 1961, 3 fairly inexperienced Army guys, were tasked with starting it back up again. And when they went to get the fission reaction going, get the whole thing up and running, they pulled the control rod out too far because the theory is that it was stuck. And they were yanking on it to pull it up, and then they pulled it too far, and it caused an immediate, huge reaction that caused the reactor to blow up. So this kind of gets to the problem that we have to think about when it comes to nuclear reactors. The technology can be quite safe if we are doing the maintenance, if we are, dotting the I's and crossing the T's. But if we get sloppy about it, the mistakes are huge, and the potential for real fallout is, no pun intended, is dramatic. So the contrast to this is you look at the nuclear navy, which has been running basically since the late 1940s, early 1950s. They've never had an accident, and it's been 80 years now. So it can be done, but you have to really take the safety seriously.
So really the questionable variable here is us.
Yeah, it is. looking at what happened in Ukraine after the Russians illegally invaded, and they're shelling the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant there, and it's like, you're shelling a nuclear plant. Like, that's not smart. So you just kind of wonder sometimes where our heads are.
Sure. I mean, and there are other variables as well. I'm thinking about natural disasters, for example. We're going to get into more of this in a moment, but first we're going to take a quick break. And when we return, I'll continue my conversation with Laura Krantz. She's a journalist who produced the podcast Wild Thing Going Nuclear. This is The Metro on WDET. Stay with us. On WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent, and I'm speaking with journalist Laura Krantz. She is co-founder of Foxtopus Inc. She produced the 2022 podcast Wild Thing Going Nuclear, where she explored the possibilities and the drawbacks of nuclear energy. We're discussing her podcast amid the Palisades nuclear power plant getting the green light to load fuel into its facility in West Michigan. That means it's one step closer to reopening. Laura, a big takeaway from your reporting is that people don't necessarily assess risk looking at facts and figures. Instead, a lot of the way we do it is based on a feeling, which comes from seeing something spectacular, a big crash, a stabbing, for example, even if those kinds of things rarely happen. Here's a conversation you had in episode 8 of Wild Thing Going Nuclear with Leif Van Boeven, a professor of psychology, about how we assess what scares us.
The modern world poses kind of a problem for us.
The way that we engage with information in the modern environment hijacks some of those naturally occurring processes, and our reactions don't have an opportunity to correct themselves, and so we end up being over afraid of things that we really shouldn't be all that afraid of.
Like, say, a terrorist attack.
And we end up being completely not bothered by risks that are actually really, really dangerous.
Like driving a car.
So despite there not being a lot of deaths or harm attributed to nuclear power plant accidents, these accidents can be so big and devastating, they really scare people. And so now many of us are freaked out about nuclear energy. But you've researched nuclear energy from a lot of different perspectives. So, Laura, how should we adequately weigh the risks of it? In your eyes, what are the biggest concerns?
Yeah, so I just want to be fully transparent here. And I was a lot more nervous about nuclear before I started this project. I remember Chernobyl. When I was a kid, I remember I watched Fukushima on television as it was happening. Like, these are very dramatic, huge events that really take up a lot of space. And of course, you've seen all the mutant movies, and Hollywood kind of makes a bigger deal out of this. So these kinds of things are percolating in the background, and it's understandable that people are freaked out about them. But for me, a better understanding of how it works and how radiation affects us was really useful in allaying some of my concerns. I'm not going to grind up uranium and snort it, but I think I grasped the risks much better than I did prior to this. I think there's a few things to remember, too, even with these big accidents. Chernobyl, the kinds of reactors that they were using in Russia, they knew they were problematic. There was all kinds of history of written history about the issues that these reactors had. But Soviet Russia, the way it was structured and the way that the system worked in terms of control from the top, there was no way for people who were lower down the ladder to say, hey, there's real problems with here, we need to fix them. It was just sort of, you kept going forward and you just hoped it didn't happen on your watch. And likewise with Fukushima, there were warnings about where they had built some of the reactors and the generators specifically, saying that there was a 100-year tsunami event or flood event could wipe out the generators and the reactor could shut down. But because they were like, well, it's a 100-year event, we don't really need to worry about it until they did. So this kind of goes back to my point about if people can make smart decisions and really cautious decisions about these things, I think it lessens the potential for damage considerably. The other thing, though, that is concerning to me, I guess, is, if a city or a state is moving forward with a nuclear project, there's got to be a lot of transparency and a lot of education and opportunities for people to voice their concerns. I was reading a little bit about what's happening in Palisades, and the company that is rebooting the reactor there, they've never done this before. And so people are concerned about that, and they want to weigh in, and they want to know that they've been heard. And I think that that's really important. But the bigger problem, I think, is that trust in scientists, in media, in government, these are at an all-time low. And I think that is going to be a huge problem, which is why that transparency aspect of this is so important.
I want to think a little bit more deeply about the effects on people, the unintended effects. And specifically, I'm wondering, Laura, what do we know about the connection between exposure to uranium particles, which are used for nuclear energy, and cancer?
This is a really hard question, and this is not one that was readily answered as I was doing this research. The problem is we don't entirely know, and it may be on an individual basis. Some people may be more susceptible to exposure and it may cause cancer, whereas someone else may not ever feel the effects of having been exposed to radiation. We do know that in general, higher exposure to radiation results in more cancers, but there is a certain baseline level of radiation that we are all exposed to all the time, right, and in fact may have been and was likely an important part of the evolution of life on this planet, because this planet is constantly being bombarded by radiation from the sun, and then there's also, radiation on the ground, and we have radioactive particles in us. Carbon-14 is a radioactive particle. So it is a tough question. In general, I think you want to minimize your exposure, and the goal of the plants should be to minimize exposure. But there is, I think there's a threshold at which you're going to be okay. Mm-hmm. But again, it comes down to the individual as well.
So it's hard to draw definitive lines when we're mm-hmm. thinking about nuclear energy, uranium exposure, and cancer. I realize, though, another concern that people have is with nuclear waste, and that's for good reason. Yeah. What do you do with the nuclear material after it's been used? I mean, what did your reporting tell you about how we safely contain it? That is something that endures.
Mm-hmm. It totally is. And it's not helped by, cartoons like The Simpsons with barrels of green goo leaking out of them, which is not how they store radioactive waste. They used to, though. So this gets kind of back to our problem of not fully understanding this stuff and still trying to get the whole range
picture,
of information. So, but, at this point, at least the reactors that I saw, when the uranium, when the uranium or the plutonium in a reactor can't sustain a chain reaction anymore, it's considered spent. And spent fuel is what most people are talking about when they talk about nuclear waste. So we usually take that fuel and first we put it in a cooling pond, which is like this giant swimming pool lined with concrete. And it'll stay there for 1 to 2 years until the most radioactive elements have decayed, have become less of a concern. And then from there, the fuel usually gets put in large steel reinforced concrete containers. This is known as dry storage. These are called dry casks. They're just big concrete gray cylinders. You can walk right up to them safely, put your hand on them. I had a Geiger counter with me. It didn't go off at all. And at many of the reactors around the US, those dry casks are just stored on site. They're just kind of sitting there. For a while, there was discussion of a big waste repository where all this stuff would go at Yucca Mountain in Nevada. That got shut down. So, the big question is, where now? Do we put it in one place? Do we put it in many places? Do we leave it where it is? It's safe enough where it is at the moment, but this stuff is going to be around for a really long time. And how do you warn future generations or alien invaders, should they ever show up, that this stuff is toxic? How do you make sure that linguistically translates across tens of thousands of years? And I know there's some discussion in New Mexico. They're enlarging WIPP, the waste. Oh, I've forgotten what the acronym stands for. It's WIPP. And they have created 2 new big rooms where they're going to be able to put some of the most radioactive waste that we have. But, is it more dangerous to transport it than it is to just leave it in place? So these are worthwhile questions to be having. And again, like the health issue, it's a lot of gray area. We don't know what the right answer is, and there may not be a right answer.
Laura, you're outlining some of the reasons that nuclear power plants are really expensive. And so that has me wondering as well where your reporting led you on the topic of subsidizing nuclear energy. Do you think we need to be subsidizing it for private companies, or can we leave it to them to build these plants up and work on these very intricate processes that you've described?
Yeah, the U.S. government has subsidized all forms of energy and all different kinds of ways. So I don't necessarily have any problem with that. And often the national labs are working with private companies in partnership to develop these and put them into commercial use. That's part of the purpose of the national labs, is to create the breeding ground for this stuff so that it can be moved out into the general public. I did raise my eyebrows a little bit when I heard about Microsoft getting these big subsidies for rebooting 3 Mile Island. I'm like, Microsoft has a lot of money. Last I checked, they didn't pay a tremendous amount of taxes, so maybe they could use those savings on their taxes to invest a little bit more in those projects rather than counting on taxpayer money to do it. But that's my opinion. I don't know if that makes sense financially or whatever happened. But the one thing that does concern me about private industry, and this gets back to the human element of things, is what happens when the shareholders want to see more of a return, and these companies start cutting corners in order to make those returns. There's a lot of safety inherent in this. And I just want to be sure that if you are having private companies who are running these kinds of things, that they are going to do the job right rather than try to make the most money.
Right.
And I think that can be done. The airline industry, they're privately run companies. They make a lot of money, but airline safety is paramount. So
highly regulated still by the federal government.
Exactly. And I think that will always be necessary. I think you're going to have good, solid regulation. It may not need to be quite to the level that it is now. And I did hear a lot of complaints from people saying it's just too many hoops to jump through. And that is in part what drives up the cost. Yeah. And this I'm not familiar enough with to know how much regulation is the right amount of regulation.
Well, when you talk about safety concerns, that has me wondering about folks in your hometown in Idaho Falls, which will likely be developing a nuclear energy plant. What are people most concerned about there?
Yeah, so when I was reporting this, Idaho Falls Power was part of a group of utilities that was working with Utah Power to get energy from small modular reactors made by a company called NuScale. That deal fell through. The project cost way too much. It was going way over schedule, and the city council felt that the responsible thing to do was to back out before ratepayers were on the hook for very expensive electricity. I'm not as up to date on their most recent development, but it does sound like Idaho Falls Power is now partnering with a different nuclear company to try again. I think there's still a lot of regulatory hoops to jump through, and the same problems that dogged the first attempt might sink this too, whether it's economical or not. But interestingly, I went into this reporting expecting everyone in town to be freaked out, like, oh, there's going to be a nuclear accident, we're all going to die, everyone's going to turn into, they're going to have 3 eyes and the babies will be born with frog legs. What most people were concerned about was the economics of it. Will this be cost effective? Will this keep electric rates low? That's what people were most worried about, which I thought was really interesting. And, I was doing, again, some reading on the Palisades stuff, and that sounds like it was kind of one of the big things in that area, too. There were a few people who were worried about the safety concerns, but a lot of people were like, will this happen? Will there be jobs? Will this be economical for the region? So it is interesting that I think as we've gotten more exposed to nuclear energy and the idea of nuclear energy, some of those fears that we have had have been allayed.
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering if that speaks to a change in our level of comfort and how culture is changing. Or does it speak to our propensity as humans to be a bit short-sighted?
That's $1 million question right there, and I don't have an answer to that one.
Laura, you published this podcast 3 years ago. I'm wondering, before we let you go, have you changed your mind on nuclear energy since producing the podcast? I mean, I realize one main point that you've really honed in on is that it's more about the people who are operating nuclear energy, and it's less about the technology where your concerns lie.
Yeah, I still feel that way, although I do think nuclear energy has a lot of promise. We have incredible demands for energy now. It's just mind-blowing how much energy we gobble up. And if we want to sustain that, if we want to keep that lifestyle going, and we also don't want to cook ourselves on this planet, we have to consider all of the different energy sources. And I think nuclear is a very solid choice. And I think there are ways for it to be done that are safe and economical and smart and, can be helpful to a lot of communities.
Before I really let you go this time, Laura, there is one more thing I want to ask you, and that is if a city or state is going forward with a nuclear energy power plant, as we're seeing happening here in Michigan, something, again, that we know scares a lot of people, how should that company and the city and the state engage with the public on it?
Yeah, and this gets back to my point about transparency and education. Like, talk to people, have stakeholder meetings, listen to what people are saying, hear what their fears might be. Maybe you do some sort of like cultural exchange where you send people who are concerned to other communities where nuclear has been done well and let them talk to people there and get a sense of it. Like, I really think that this education part and the transparency part are so important because, these are concepts that are they're not easy to understand, as I can attest. And so getting the opportunity to ask your questions and have them answered in a way that is compassionate to your concerns, I think is so important for people who are on the fence about this or are maybe a little scared.
Laura Krantz is a journalist, editor, producer, and co-founder of Foxtopus Inc. She produced the excellent 2022 podcast Wild Thing, Going Nuclear, where she explored the possibilities and drawbacks of nuclear energy. We will link to the podcast on our website, wdet.org. You can also find it wherever you get podcasts. Laura, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
This is the Metro on WDET, where our listener survey is open and we're looking for your feedback. It helps shape the future of Detroit Public Radio. Filling out the survey is fast, it's anonymous, and it lets us know some important data, what you love, what you'd like more of, and where we can improve. Visit WDET.org/survey and please take it now. Thank you. Coming up, just before the primary election, Detroit City Clerk Janice Winfrey told us fewer than 5 polling places have accessibility issues. Disability advocates say it's more than 150. We'll hear their evidence and what they want fixed before the November general election. That's next here on the Metro. Stay with us.